Hello, every folks, and good morning. Welcome to a video that was fittingly delayed by life chaos despite being about life chaos. So today, we are going to be talking about how to essentially fit in a hobby such as games in this particular example, essentially fit it into a busier life as you get older, as you start having more and more nonsense to deal with on the regular, as you start seeing more and more chaos that you simply cannot address all at once. So this is a topic that is going to it's going to address a lot of my personal experience on this whole thing, so please bear in mind that some of the stuff said here might need to be scaled to your situation, or might work differently in your case, or, might have to be tweaked entirely, but either way, it's going to be the stuff that essentially worked or didn't work for me personally, and maybe that'll kind of help jog some stuff loose, so to speak. So, with that said, let's go ahead and get into it here. So, the simple answer is actually one that somebody went and pretty much dropped on there, while also the simple answer is somebody that commented right after. Namely, if you want to be able to still fit in games and such into your life as you get older, as you have kids, as you have multiple jobs, the simple answer is to go get yourself a handheld. But it's not so simple as all of that. Now, on paper, yes it is, but in reality, there's a lot more to it. So, when it comes to picking the type of handheld that'll work for you, that is a topic that potentially can get a decent bit more complicated. Because again, everyone's situation is going to be a little bit different. And it's going to depend entirely on just kind of the people around you, whether, again, you're somebody with kids or somebody that's busy or whatnot else. Like if somebody happens to, let's say, work extremely long hours, but they have a fairly laid-back job, and say they want to be able to play a hell of a lot of things, and want to have the most options available to them, then yeah, absolutely, something like a Steam Deck would work amazingly well. But realistically, somebody that's going and having to make ends meet by doing food deliveries and whatever else, working odd hours, maybe going into sketchy neighborhoods and whatnot else, they're going to have a little bit of a harder time potentially making that work, they don't really want to take something relatively pricey and bring it into a dangerous area. Like, for me personally, to give you an idea of the kind of chaos that goes on in my day, typically the wife and I are up at 5, get her her breakfast and coffee, make sure uniform and whatever else is all ready. Essentially see her off in the morning, go check on her chickens, collect the eggs, make sure that they're all fed and watered, get the dogs out, make sure that they're not trying to eat each other's poo, which is freaking disgusting, but hey, dogs are gonna dog. And then you gotta go double check on the garden, make sure that's all watered, make sure that, nobody's getting into that thing. And this is assuming that nobody's tried to eat the chickens this week. One of those wonderful things of whenever something happens in the woods, all the happy little critters find new places to go scavenge. Anyway, and then that's before even getting to the kids' breakfast, getting them ready for school, or making sure that they're doing their chores and stuff during the summer. There's a lot of things to consider at all times, and this is then immediately followed by having to, essentially just do whatever work I can over the course of the day, whatever kind of house maintenance needs to be done, whatever car work needs to be done, since if at all possible, I, do my own car repairs and stuff like that. So it's one of these cases where no matter what, there's always going to be something to do. I mean, even after all of this, ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm still going and essentially still working into the night, doing food deliveries, or whatever other side gigs are around, whether it's, working as labor, working in manufacturing, or whatever else is kind of available. Just anything to help pay the bills, because they seem to constantly creep up, while income seems to always creep down. What a fun little thing. Anyway, so the kinds of chaos that we all have to deal with is tremendous. Now, again, as you get older, it just seems to keep on stacking up. Now, finding something to kind of keep your old hobbies alive in that situation obviously can be tricky. You don't want to be perceived as lazy. You don't want to accidentally, cause any kind of financial issues for your family. As a bit of an example, like for me personally, I'm always absolutely terrified of ever spending a cent on anything that isn't directly benefiting everybody in the household. I tend to be really paranoid about that kind of stuff, and it's one of those things that it's not even really a voluntary choice after a while. Like, you physically cannot make yourself spend spend money on yourself, you know? I feel like all parents get there eventually. Like, my wife and I have had conversations at multiple, multiple instances of like, okay, realistically, we kind of need this. We're like, yeah, I know, I also kind of need this. Like, if I buy it for you, that's not buying it for myself, and if you buy it for me, that's not, then you're not buying it for yourself. So you kind of have a unselfish quid pro quo kind of situation, you know. Anyway, so with that said, how do we fit a hobby like games into that type of situation? Well, it basically comes down to kind of finding that cross section between the library the library that you're looking for in a more abstract sense, as well as the kind of portability that you need to not get in your way on a daily basis. Again, this is stuff that seems obvious, but more to it. So what I mean by that cross-section there, in a lot of cases, there's stuff that you may like, and you may be trying to find exact copies of that exact thing when you're out and about. So, like, let's say, like in my instance, I was a fan of basically everything FromSoft ever put out, but especially I was really into a lot of the Soulsborne games for a while. I mean, I still am, but was certainly more into those for a while. And there were those moments when, for example, I would end up going and taking a look over and over and over, like, are they releasing on anything else? And so, you'd see, for example, DS1 made it to the Switch, 2 didn't, 3 was considered, but I don't know what happened there. But that was about it. And ultimately, the one that I actually ended up playing was, like, as far as getting that Soulsborne fix on the go, was actually none of the official Souls releases, but instead a wonderful little game by the name of Salt and Sanctuary over on the PS Vita. Because when the kids were born, I found that just kind of whatever handheld I had was getting way, way, way more use than, for example, my computer that I'd like to play games on. So more often than not, it became like, what can I actually fit into just kind of playing on the go? And not even necessarily on the go all the time. I mean, like, on the go in terms of, like, you just be at home, like, let's say, burping the kiddos, they're going to sleep, they're sitting on your shoulder, and something very lightweight that you can keep in your pocket is extremely handy for just, essentially just throwing the sleeping kiddo over your shoulder and going and playing. And this actually gets me to the next thing that I will inevitably forget to cover again, and that's going to be buttons. See, when it comes to button press noises, this is, again, something that oftentimes is ignored when folks will consider a device. They're looking at the power, they're looking at the library, but the ergonomics, the visuals to other people, the buttons on the device, it's not just about how comfortable they are to press, but how do they fit into the sound situation in your house? Do you have, let's say, a spouse that's extremely annoyed by small sounds? Do you have, let's say, kiddos that would easily get woken by, let's say, a sort of creaking sound on certain types of triggers? Do you potentially have some very curious toddlers running around that might potentially, just immediately hear a specific type of click, get out of bed, and then immediately, go and see what the hell's up? All of this stuff can matter. So, like, for example, if you have toddlers around, you may have potentially seen those moments when they're extremely excited over the sound, over, for example, a keyboard. They're like, wow, you can press so many buttons at once, this is amazing. Only to then realize, like, they just keep getting out of bed as soon as you start typing, so that's not going to work. So you need, for example, a quieter keyboard or something. These are things that oftentimes have to be considered. And so, like, in my personal case, when the kiddos were growing up, I had been using a PSP for probably like a decade plus at that point, and I was noticing that for example, the face buttons were well and quiet, but when it came to using the triggers or the analog stick on the PSP, it was making a unique sound that was kind of annoying them a little bit, And so when I had randomly gotten a hold of a Vita one day, I was noticing that using a silicone cover, I don't think it was even silicone, I think it was just like some kind of rubber coating on the thing, it basically, the sounds that the thing make, like, I don't know if you can hear that, but when I'm going and pressing the button, even right up against the microphone, it's not terribly loud. Meanwhile, if we have a PSP over here, which I probably can just reassemble its buttons real quick, because I'm trying to fix a few of them. Here's your R trigger. Buy R trigger. Okay, L trigger it is. But I guess it helps if I actually have the mechanism in there. Oh, you know what? Hold on. Let's just slap this sucker in here. There you go. You need something to bounce off of, don't you? There you go. Yeah, we'll get to the repair thing in a moment, but these typically click a lot more, right? So that kind of stuff is definitely noticeable in your situation, and sometimes it can only be one button that gets in the way that ends up being a bit of a problem for you personally. Like for the longest time, I was worried that the kind of heftier sounds, if you can hear that, from like the D-pad and the buttons on the Vita would potentially be an issue. But one thing that I kept noticing repeatedly is that, for example, my wife did not care about those sounds; she could barely hear them. Or, for example. The kiddos were barely aware of what this device was because to them it didn't look like the kind of thing that would usually be fun. So again, it all depends on how the people around you also perceive the device you're carrying. Actually, another little note on this is when it comes to using devices in public. This is also something that comes up somewhat regularly, especially if you happen to be kind of familiar with the SBC community or single board computer community, which basically covers a lot of handhelds of various types. Again, just referring to them as single board computers, but they're basically just a bunch of various shapes of emulator Game Boy, more or less. And one of those things that comes up a lot is going to be, hey, look, I'm playing this thing in public, be proud of me. And the thing is, in my personal experience, that has mattered, but those almost exclusively resulted in some weird stuff when I was going and, trying out a couple of different ones. Let me explain. So, when it comes to playing a game out in public, it obviously depends on setting. Are you, let's say, having a game night with the other parents? Are you, in a professional setting or something along those lines? What do you have? What will it look like? How will it reflect on you? Will it affect your life? Because remember, the most important thing when it comes to all of these different handhelds and picking out something that'll work for you is finding out a way to make this all unobtrusive, to make it casual, to make it something that will not make others think that it's interfering with your life. And this is obviously an irritating thing to think about because it's like you're sitting on your phone, you're wasting your battery, that is not going to be available for you sooner. I am doing a way more practical version of what you're doing. Why are you the one judging me right now, kind of thing, So anyways, let's cover that a little bit. So as far as the visuals for other devices, like I noticed back in the day, I used to travel as an assistant. I used to spend a lot of times on planes and whatever else, and generally speaking, if you ever had a Game Boy of any variety, people are just going to give you funny looks. I don't know that many people that carry around a Game Boy these days, but unless you're the sort that brings in enough money to be able to just kind of casually make it seem like you have nothing to worry about, that will definitely get you some negative looks. It'll definitely get you some funny stares. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend carrying one of those. But in my personal experience, as soon as I started carrying around, let's say something like a PSP, because I should probably mention I don't mean Game Boys necessarily. I do kind of extend that to DSs and unfortunately 3DSs as well. Even the black one, we'll get to that in a moment. But if 3DSs generally have kind of had that same thing of potentially getting some funny looks because people know what it is, and to them it is perceived as a thing for children. Funnily enough, the Switch falls into this category as well. But as we go on here, what I noticed was that whenever I had a PSP out, generally speaking, because of the fact that it's a fairly subdued-looking device, and due to the fact that nothing about it visually sticks out that much, it tends to be something that's overlooked. Like especially if, like, let's say even nowadays, every now and then I will carry a PSP with me, out for food deliveries and such, right? So oftentimes, I'll just be waiting in line, waiting for something to get ready or whatever else, and usually what I'll find is that nobody really seems to care if I have a PSP out and about, and oftentimes I've even gotten some folks that are like, I miss my one of those, or I have one of those at home. I should really bring it with me to work, because it's extremely lightweight. You can run a lot of things on it, and every time I've told somebody, like, no, look, you can basically run whatever the hell stuff you remember from back on the day on this thing. Like, oh man, I wish they made one of those for like a SNES or something. Like, buddy, you can run that on this. Like, oh man, does it do Game Boy stuff? Yeah. It's like, man, I would never carry a Game Boy around, but that's pretty cool. I'm like, yeah, hell yeah, it is. Like, man, does it do PS1 stuff? Yeah. Does it do PS2 stuff? I'm playing PS2 stuff right now. It's one of those kind of just that right bubble of capability while also being very cheap to get a hold of. So in terms of being unobtrusive, something like a PSP is very, very cheap to acquire. Like one of the most common ways for somebody to actually get one is to actually go on eBay. They would simply go essentially buy two broken ones, combine the parts from those broken ones into one functional one, and then just essentially sell off whatever remaining parts were left over. You can find broken ones constantly for like 20-25 bucks on eBay. And so you just get like a broken 2 or 3,000, and usually when somebody lists them as broken, you know what they actually mean? They actually mean, hey, I can't be bothered to look up whether batteries for these things still exist. You know what? Whatever. It's dead. I don't care. You know, how much can this thing really be worth? And so they'll put it up for like 20 bucks, whatever. Who cares? And then you can go ahead and pick one of those up. So let's say, like, one of the scenarios that I've repeated over and over is, financial situations got dire. I had to sell my Vita, and so I pop out the chip for use at a later time. I go and switch over to a PSP for a while. I pick up those two broken PSPs, get one functional one. It turns out both were functional. They just needed batteries, so I go buy a couple cheap batteries. You can get some okay batteries for like $6-7 on Amazon. The better ones are like 20 bucks. Like, if you can get a camera Encino, if it's one that you're going to keep around a while, but if you know you're going to have a charger handy, you don't mind losing some battery life on that thing, you're perfectly fine just running one of those cheaper batteries. But anyway, so I go and fix those up, and essentially what has happened in this situation is, let's say there was a car repair that was needed, right? All expenses were completely burned for that month. Everything was going terribly. It was, just stuff was dire across the board, right? And so what happened was, would take the Vita and sell it for like 150. 150. I've seen them go as high as 300, though I'm pretty sure that person was just completely stoned out of their mind when they made that offer, but I wasn't about to say no. So I was like, yeah, you know what? Let me just get the data off this thing and ship it to you immediately. We're not going to look twice at this. Anyway, so yeah, needed, let's say, $100 in that particular case to replace the water pump in my car, as well as about $50 for the radiator hoses. And so yeah, I had sold the Vita off. Ended up going to a plasma appointment, getting about $40. Going and picking up two separate PSPs in that instance, two of the 2000 models. And in that case, one of them was about $15. The other one was like 20 and change. But in both those cases, they basically didn't need much of anything. One had a functional battery, but a broken charging port. The other one had a dead battery, and had a good charging port. So basically, ultimately, I had to replace one charging port, which was like $4 or $5 purchase on eBay, and then from there, it was just a matter of swapping out the parts, and I already had a functional device ready to go. Then I got that port, got a new battery as soon as there was a little bit more money that came in. Popped that battery into that second device. Ended up going and finding that thing a new home as well, and ultimately I was still here with my One Vision pocket device, since most of what I play on the go is going to be like Armored Core or One Vision, or like PS1 games and whatever else. And so it ended up working out really well, allowing me to essentially go and cover the expenses for this car repair, allowed me to not kind of dip into family funds in order to to cover what was effectively my work car, and allowed for for still kind of keeping with my same hobbies, while also not really having too many worries about just kind of cutting the hobby out of my life, so to speak. So either way, that was one of those nice opportunities just to kind of use as a showcase of, like, you can technically get into kind of bartering handhelds and whatever else in order to potentially keep this whole thing going, in order to consistently keep your hobbies in your life. Now, that's one angle for it, but one thing that I also want to mention is, as far as devices go, while the PSP is good, obviously there's going to be the argument over devices with better libraries, and potentially far vaster libraries. So I mentioned earlier that one of those things was potentially kind of similar games reaching a not necessarily the exact same itch, but potentially allowing for kind of scratching a similar itch while out and about. I don't know. I'm trying to make the same throw. I already realized that it couldn't happen last time. Oh well, whatever. We'll just move this guy out of the way. So, like in my case, there. Like I mentioned, I wanted to play a Soulsborne game on the go, and I instead had Salt and Sanctuary, which I was told was somewhat similar, and I tried it out, and frankly, I ended up liking it more than the original stuff I was looking for. I always loved Armored Core, and in the case of that PSP there, Armored Core 3, Silent Line, Last Raven, Formula Front, that whole experience not only brought back Armored Core 3 for me personally, but it ended up getting me into the really fun situation that Formula Front could be. Did end up losing out on something like a Nexus and Ninebreaker, but, you know, it's fine. So it's one of those things where it was close enough and ended up having enough versions of the stuff that I already liked that it worked out nicely. Obviously, there was a Tactics Ogre in there as well, on top of the incredible One Vision mod. So there's a lot of stuff to like there. Now, okay, with all of that out of the way, let's go back to the visuals thing real quick. Because one of those reasons that the PSP and Vita in particular worked for me was just due to their lightweight and visuals. If you get the black models, they're fairly unassuming. People usually assume that they're just a phone, especially in recent years. More than once, I've seen somebody buy a PSP and mention that somebody thought that they were playing a phone because of the fact that their PSP had that circle on the back, and it kind of looked like one of those circles they used to hold up a phone. I forget what the hell they're called, but that kind of pop socket looking things. And so again, it kind of comes down to, is it sort of able to be stealthy, so to speak, in public? Is it something that that potentially could be sort of hidden in plain sight, as it were? Because again, people will occasionally judge you for taking a break, especially if you're somebody that's, let's say, got a lot of family, potentially has some more conservative folks in the family that are convinced that if you personally take a break, you know, you're going to go and let down everybody around you, even though they are taking a break for the third straight day in a row. And it's like, well, buddy, when are you getting off of your break and not lecturing people about not taking breaks? Because we're technically on vacation right now. That's kind of what you do here. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. So, okay, so continuing on, let's go ahead and move on to onto a few other devices, because obviously there's more out there than just the Sony devices. There's plenty of devices out there that might potentially work for you. And in terms of the emulation devices, we'll get to them, but I will say there's not necessarily always ones that will kind of fit into that sort of stealthy role, so to speak. So, like in the case of, let's say the Retroid, right? Like the Retroid Pocket 2 can easily be mistaken for a phone. Though I will say, when I went and took that thing out in public, the triggers were immediately recognized, and pretty much, again, immediately, it was known to be a game device and not a phone. That they really strongly stuck out. So that does tend to draw a bit more attention than you may necessarily want. And when it comes to, let's say, the wider devices, they oftentimes get recognized as being, you know, a Switch. And it's like, okay, so then we're back to being identified as a Switch. What's the problem with that? Incredible library. It's got some incredible games on there. And there's actually a few things that it's sort of, I guess you could say, a good example of. Now, these aren't necessarily all bad things in, you know, an overall context. It depends on your situation, but for example, a couple things that I ran into myself when using the Switch. So I'm using it as just an all-encompassing terms for all versions of the Switch for the moment. We'll get back to the other stuff shortly, but, like, for example, when I brought the Switch out to the mall, so oftentimes I will go and bring the kiddos to the mall. I'll be sitting there letting them go play. They're all hanging out in their treehouse. It's all, you know, good fun. Now, that being said, a lot of times I will, well, I say a lot of times, I almost always have a device on me in my pocket. And so when I went and had, let's say, brought my PSP, nobody said a thing. When I ended up going and bringing the Vita, nothing. When I ended up bringing the Switch, though, there was an annoying lady that was sitting next to me, one of many, you know, kind of soccer mom-esque types who like to be nosy. And so essentially the second I looked down every single time, they tried to be like, "Oh, look, your kid's over there doing," like, "Yeah, I can see them." Like, "No, no, no, your kid's over there in the tree, just in case you're wondering." I know. I just saw them go into the tunnel. It's okay. And this kept happening, and it was fairly annoying. And the thing was, this is mostly a situation that comes up whenever there's parents nearby that just simply need to go and preach to somebody about something. Like, they just can't leave well enough alone. They have to go bother somebody for some reason. I would assume it's just because they want everybody to be as miserable as they are. But either way, you will run into those types every now and then. And I only ever ran into this with the Switch. Because when it came to other handhelds that looked vaguely like a phone, because I almost always buy my devices black or some other muted color, it resulted in, well, just people assuming they were a phone. Again, with some exceptions, but generally speaking, it was the only time it was an issue. In fact, this even came up with the Steam Deck, where you'd think, due to its size, that it would gain a little bit more of a, like, oh my goodness, what is this weird toy type of reputation. But due to the fact that it's surprisingly professional looking, folks oftentimes assume you're piloting a drone or something, which, if it was Ukraine, would certainly be a fair assumption. For those that didn't know, they actually are being used in the war, which is kind of wild. But anyways, yeah, also, why am I trying to charge nothing over here? Well, that was a pointless move. Anyway, too busy chattering. So yeah, as far as all this stuff is concerned here, yeah, even the Steam Deck is somehow more stealthy than the Switch. Now, public perception is one thing, but in terms of unobtrusiveness, annoying parents potentially are not going to be something you run into on a regular basis. The more common situation that you'll run into is that a device is obtrusive due to its size, and the Steam Deck there is certainly going to be the top of that particular pile to an extent. Surprisingly, I personally find the Switch a little bit more clumsy than the Deck, but we'll get to that in a second. So when I'm talking about size, I don't necessarily just mean pocketability, but whenever you're using a device, you have to sort of tailor whatever you're bringing to whatever your situation happens to be. Like in my case, I've mentioned several times that due to the fact that I'm always watching the kiddos, I have to be able to quickly pocket the thing and move. If I cannot take several steps forward and just like move the hell straight towards something without dropping something, breaking something, whatever else, then I'm not going to be using it. Like in the case of, let's say, something like the Switch, the main reason I was able to cover Tactics Ogre Reborn when it came out was just because of the case that one of the repair projects I was working on happened to come with. There was a slim, I believe it was one of the official cases, but one of the really slimline cases that is just kind of like a little zip purse kind of looking thing. And while on paper it's not necessarily going to be the most protective, the most important thing that it actually provides is essentially smoothing off the edges of the device. That it makes it so that the analog sticks are not necessarily sticking out, that you can move this purse thing in and out of a larger pocket or vest or what have you with relative ease. It's still annoying to have to unzip it and unpack it, but and also the analog sticks also snag on the edge of the lip of the thing, but it's fine. Comparatively speaking, it's a very cozy thing to carry around. Like, carrying it that way, I tried carrying the Switch a bunch of different ways because obviously when Tor came out I was covering that thing, so I tried carrying it a bunch of different ways. Like, I always carry a vest with me, so for example, for a time I was trying to for example put it into multiple different pockets. So, like, for example, I have two little, like, I think they're supposed to be like fishing hook pockets that I would put the controllers into, and then a side pocket that I would put the tablet into. And it kind of worked, but it was just really awkward to do that. I kind of figured out a sort of, I guess you could call it a quick draw method over time that sort of helped a little bit, but not really. It was weird. So it kind of worked, sort of. There's certainly ways, but it was really putting a lot of strain onto the controllers in particular doing it that way. Especially the rails were not liking the constant attachment and detachment and whatever else. So that might work with whatever that one device is that does it magnetically, but would not do that with a Switch proper. Okay. So let's talk about the Steam Deck. What was its position in this whole thing? because whenever I brought the Steam Deck out and about, pretty much always I had it in its. Well, I have two different cases for the thing. One was a protective shell that my wife got me, and the other one is the one that it came with. And funnily enough, the protective shell thing is great for having around the house. If a toddler knocks it off of something, it's less likely to get broken. She has randomly managed to sneak off with my Steam Deck before. that was that was that was a heart attack and a half. Like, hey, your weird flat computer just got stolen. So yeah, that's certainly a thing that can happen. Anyway, sorry, getting a little bit off track here. So, as fun as that experience was, I wasn't exactly super keen to repeat it. So more often than not, I ended up using the standard case that it came with, being a generally more convenient kind of carry-around option, especially for the car. So, like, let's say I'm out doing deliveries, and I want to, let's say, go play some Reborn or play some Kingsbane, and I have this thing with me. I have it all ready to go. The flip case was enough to open it up, let's say during a pickup at a drive-through. But the largeness of the screen meant that it was very difficult for my eyes to adjust, let's say looking down and then looking back up. So, like, the quick little motion to see, like, is there still something happening in the drive-through line? Is there something happening where I am right now? That motion is hard to do on both a Switch and a Steam Deck, that your eyes simply cannot focus on both those places at the same time. But something like again, smaller thing, whether it's a smaller emulation handheld with the brightness turned down a little bit, or something like a PSP or Vita, it's easier to hold it a little bit higher, and then quickly make that motion back and forth of being able to tell kind of approximately what's going on in the line. So again, another little detail to consider if that's something that you need. So, like, again, if you're doing drive-through deliveries, oftentimes they have a tendency to get bogged down really, really bad at night, and you might potentially be in that drive-through for like 20-30 minutes. So, you want to have something with you, and again, for the deck, it's sometimes worked, but more often than not, it felt like it was straining my eyes to go and, to go and do that. Actually, the other consideration I want to throw out there in terms of eye strain, is actually design, kind of visual design of a lot of newer and older games. So, like, let's say you're playing on your Vita or something, and you're playing some Peace Walker, compared with playing, let's say Breath of the Wild on the Switch, right? And let's say Breath of the Wild, there's obviously a lot more stuff going on, a lot more visual flair to the thing. It still has some pop. It's actually one of the few things that's kind of big on the Switch, aside from indie titles, that actually made a big thing towards making sure that everything visually pops, because a lot of them are kind of proper full-screen experiences. It's actually one of the issues of it being a hybrid console like that there's going to be a lot of instances of a game that is technically, potentially, the better version of something in the series, but might be harder to play on the go. Like, let's say an MGS5 compared with a Peace Walker. In Peace Walker's case, despite being on a PSP, despite being a kind of smaller form factor experience, you'll notice that the way that they tone down the visuals, the way that they put a lot of bright colors on important locations and whatever else, makes it so that you can still easily tell what's going on and then, like, land your long distance headshots on what was previously a fairly small screen. And that's oftentimes when I'll see the kind of discussions around which one's best or whatever else, or like, oh man, this one's got the greatest visual fidelity or whatever else. I personally find that I scratch the exact same itch playing Peace Walker as I do playing MGS5, but it's just way more convenient and fits in my pocket. Because you're basically running the same gameplay loop, and in fact, I personally find Peace Walker to be mechanically more interesting. And part of that is because of the way the vehicle captures work, that in MGS5, in order to capture vehicles, you basically would go and disable them and then fly them away with a helicopter, whereas in Peace Walker, they're too heavy for that. So you have to go and essentially take out all of their entourage. Like, you can just capture all 30-plus soldiers that were guarding it, and then damage the thing enough that the pilot has to pop out and look around, at which point you go and you, like, fire a rocket balloon right in their face. It's just a hell of a lot of fun. So, to me personally, that scratched the itch a lot more, but obviously everyone's preferences are going to be different. But the main thing that I want to get across here is that a lot of games that were designed in a more portable form factor will typically have a lot of these considerations where they don't strain your eyes as much. Like when you're tired, it's the end of the day, let's say you're getting the kids to sleep, you're driving, doing deliveries, it's 2 a.m. or something, and you end up taking a look at your game, whatever it happens to be, and if it hurts your eyes to even look at, it's not doing the job of letting you essentially play play your games on the go. It's effectively serving as something for you to look forward to. Maybe when you feel a bit more rested the next day, you're not necessarily able to still keep playing it in that situation. And again, I've had that, like, let's say, comparing with Risk of Rain 1 and Risk of Rain 2, with Risk of Rain 1 being on the PS Vita and Risk of Rain 2 being on the Switch. And I've carried both of them with me at different times and had, again, similar results there, where when it came to Risk of Rain 2, objectively better game, but when it came to actually playing the thing, just simply put, the motivation was not there when, for example, I was tired at the end of the day. I would look at it, and eyes would just start glazing over. In terms of in terms of, let's say, being able to still play the thing while out and about or tired or what have you, generally I found the first one just visually popped a bit more. And that being said, it's even one of the less kind of visually well done things on the Vita there, because it actually was originally a full screen game. Normally it would be a pretty bad kind of example of this whole thing. In fact, let me go ahead and show you. Actually, no, we're not going to get into that. My issue with this video, part of the reason that I'm redoing it for the third time now, is I keep getting distracted with, like, and here's one example, and then we get completely off track. Anyway, let's continue on though. So eye strain is something to consider. The way that the visuals of the device look to other people, so that it doesn't look, like a toy, so to speak, is also important to consider. And obviously the price point is also something to consider. So one thing that I would recommend to any folks that are potentially looking into something like this is to think about learning to repair the device in question, whatever it may happen to be. Because sometimes you're better, well, actually, not even sometimes, a lot of times you're better off potentially finding ways to repair a broken device than you are getting a new one. Because let's say you're digging into your expenses, whatever they may happen to be, and if you're better off, then fine. I'm sure nobody's going to say a dang thing if you spend whatever you want to spend. But if you're on the struggle bus, like most of us here, you'll generally find that you're going to get some unwarranted or unwanted hostility if you are seen as spending money that you shouldn't be spending. So, like in the case of, let's say, something again like those PSPs or Vitas or something like that, it's very easy to find them, fix them, make a profit while replacing a broken device, or while repairing a device, or just getting one fresh. It's possible to regularly make a profit off of something like that. It's not enough to make a business out of, but it is enough to. It's kind of in that sweet spot of being perfect for a situation like this here, where you kind of need to low-key find a way to entertain yourself without causing too many ripples, and something like the Switch can potentially fall into that thing as well, but unfortunately it's a device that is also, like, you could potentially go and reshell one to something that's a bit more kind of modest in its visuals, but everyone will still identify it as a Switch. It will, no matter what, be seen as a Switch. Any case that it comes with will look like a Switch case. And it will inevitably get you some looks. Even the Switch Lite, which generally looks a bit more muted in the gray version there, will still have that same thing, where everyone knows that it's a Switch. Like, there's no question over what the device is. And that could potentially, be a bit of a optics issue for you in your situation. It doesn't mean that it's always the situation, but just something to be aware of, Okay. So with that said, though, something like the Steam Deck, again, oftentimes has a tendency to give somebody more of a visual of, like, this person knows something I don't. What is this crazy, rare-looking device? But this gets us to the other problem of potential rarity, where if a device is seen as valuable, that could, again, be a bit of an issue. Like, in my personal case, the only reason I could possibly justify getting one of these was simply put because my laptop had died, and because it's able to replace a laptop. If it didn't have that functionality, there's no way in hell that I would possibly have a Steam Deck right now. Simply put, because of the price point of the thing. Now, it's not for the price. Steam Decks are a hell of a deal. Like, compared with laptops, they are effectively the same price as a frickin' Chromebook, which basically does nothing. They are, objectively speaking, incredible deals. There's no way they're not taking a huge loss on these things when they're selling them. They have great performance for a computer. They are very simple to set up as a computer because everyone's usually using a USB setup anyway, and that's basically all you need. They're very simple to dock. They're very simple to pick up and carry around. And if you have a job that you can do off of the Steam Deck there, which I'm sure a lot more than realize that they actually can, then it might be perfect for your situation. That if you're able to do whatever it is. Like, I've done Photoshop editing from the device itself. It's like, it again. Linux, a lot of folks are scared of learning Linux. Every time that I've ever seen anyone nearby me go and try one, recently actually one of my best friends was reaching out and saying like, hey, I tried Linux for the first time, this is way easier than I thought. That's been the kind of running theme I've seen from any folks that were trying it. That, yeah, it did look like it does look a lot scarier than it really is to get into Linux, and it actually comes with the added benefit that it typically does not have all of the extra junk that's on, let's say, a normal PC or what have you. It's just not loaded down with stuff. It typically runs faster. Typically is. If you want something to be on there, it's only on there because you wanted it to be there. It didn't just sort of happen, you know? Now, the thing with something like Steam Deck, again, is it's not necessarily always going to be nimble enough for every situation. If you have a job where you're potentially static for long periods of time, or, at the end of the day you have some sit-down time, it serves as a sort of similar to a laptop type of role, where you don't necessarily want to keep it on you at all times, but man, oh man, it's going to give you some incredible value for your buck there. So, again, something to consider. Now, going back to those single-board computers that we were talking about before. So what's the deal with them? So there's a lot of emulation handhelds out there of all shapes and sizes, and more than likely, I guarantee many of you that are potentially looking at this will probably end up getting one of those instead. Because they're typically going to be, like, any form factor that you like, you'll almost definitely find. Pretty much any game library that you like from any time in recent years, unless it's something oddly specific, you'll probably find there. Like in my personal case, again, I'm covering the Ogre Battle series all the time. It's something I love to play all the time. I love Armored Core stuff all the time. I ended up landing on the Vita. Okay, it's just basically the perfect cross section for me personally. But like, for example, I saw someone not that long ago who, for example, played a lot of One Vision, but also happened to be a fan of a lot of games that they had on mobile, but also liked emulating a lot of specific older things, and a Retroid ended up fitting that thing for them personally. But they were worried about it looking like a Switch, so they went for the 2S, which ends up still looking like a phone, but it's a bit stubbier and better performing than the regular 2. But then they ran into another issue that I want to address here, and that's going to be availability of parts. So one thing to consider whenever picking up a device is whether or not you're going to be able to replace the thing if something happens. If you are busier, you have to bear in mind that every now and then you may run into an issue where something may happen to your device. If it's something that you keep on you at all times, the danger is there. Now, these different devices will obviously all have different issues. Those emulator devices, despite being available in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, are typically not made with durability in mind. So those have a tendency to get smashed a lot easier than something like, a lot of the Sony offerings, or even Switches for that matter. So just kind of be aware that that could be something that you run into. I'm not saying that it necessarily will all the time, but half the dang posts on the Retroid Reddit are just, hey, look, my device just sort of exploded one day, what a shame. So just bear in mind that that's a thing. Now, you may notice when I was talking about the PSP, I mentioned that it's still being used regularly despite being a 2-decade-old device at this point. How the hell is this thing still ticking? Simply put, the availability of parts. Those old boards hold up surprisingly well. One of the only things that are kind of difficult to replace on there is going to be the fuses, and most of them end up holding up just fine, even up till today. They're generally something that has stood the test of time extremely well, not because they're incredibly powerful, but specifically because of the opposite. See, when it comes to a lot of these lighter weight devices, their lightweightness is actually part of their kind of defensiveness, so to speak. So, like one of the comments that I got off of my recent dad device video, I say recent, that was actually months ago now that I think about it. But one of the comments that I got from it was somebody saying, hey, you're not allowed to call the Vita resilient. You know, I went and I shoved it in my skinny pants and they were, so far tied up there, I practically shoved the device up my ass and it ended up damaging and giving kind of repairability or perceived repairability of a device. Maintenance in general on any of these devices is going to vary to a certain extent. Whether or not you're properly taking care of it, it can be just a kind of a matter of whether you're carrying the thing in the right way or what have you. So, like, for example, one of the things that I ran into with when I was experimenting around with the Switch Lite, because, there's a lot of Switch stuff that I was hoping to cover, especially once I'd heard that there was a mod that might potentially allow for USB-C video out. It seemed like something that I would be potentially looking into more in the future, but as it stood, when I was going and looking at it, one of the issues that I had whenever it was being carried around was, ironically, that despite being picked up for being smaller, being slightly too small was part of its issue. Essentially being a device that, rather than, like, let's say, the Switch in that vertical slim case sitting vertically in a vest pocket, it instead would end up going sideways and essentially stick out a bit more. Now, tiny things like this seem like they'd be inconsequential, and sometimes they are, but the thing is, a lot of times they're not. That's kind of the issue here. That tiny things like that could be the difference between your device lasting a really long time or potentially not lasting at all. Like, let's say in the case of, again, because I can't seem to stop comparing it with the PSP and Vita here. Like, in the case of the PSP, it's not necessarily rounded off on the edges. It's defensively decently built. It's basically like one solid, very, I guess you could say, flexible feeling shell that tends to do a pretty good job of taking knocks and making sure that the stuff inside is safe, while additionally being so lightweight that realistically very little is going to pose much of a threat to it. Part of the reasons that the PSPs have stayed around for so dang long is just because whenever a PSP is hit by something, usually it ends up surviving for one, but additionally, it has a tendency to sort of deflect away the hit, and they tend to be so light that it's kind of like if you've ever thrown darts at the fair and they happen to have those slightly deflated balloons and the dulled tip darts, and you're like, why the hell is this dart bouncing off this balloon? What what is this black magic bullshit? That's basically how the PSP is built. That it tends to have it to get knocked around more so than actually getting directly damaged. Like hits that knock the thing tend to carry it forward. So, like, let's say you're walking through a doorway, you're wearing a vest, and it happens to clip the edge of the doorway. Realistically, it's just getting sent backwards. It's not actually taking that much of a hit. The shell might take a little bit of a knock, worst case scenario, but it probably won't really cause any long-term damage in most situations. Even if it ends up getting hit from the front, they're built in such a way that the slider is typically there to protect the screen. The buttons are typically there as a spongy layer in case it ever lands on its face to, again, protect the screen. And these little design decisions tend to get overlooked when, folks are just comparing the raw power of all of these various devices. That might be exactly what you need in a lot of situations. It's one of the reasons that one of the only times that I've actually lost a PSP for any reason was from a Black Friday shopper that ran into me using a shopping cart. That essentially they were running full speed and hit it with the corner directly on the screen, and even then, it was enough that it was just a simple $30 fix, and we were back up and running. Nothing too terribly worrisome about that situation. So either way, just bear that in mind. In the case of the Vita, funnily enough, it's built with that exact same kind of thought process in mind, where it will end up, let's say, if you ever take a look at, let's say, the Vita Slim, I won't say this about the OLED Vita. I personally, I like those things, but I personally prefer the Slim model. But if you ever take a look at the OLED or the Slim model, kind of look at one of them from the side, they are extremely defensively built. The edges are very sharply rounded, meaning that if, for example, it's hit from the side, more often than not, it's sent sideways rather than taking the hit directly. And even then, the shell is an improved version of what the PSP had, with 2 different layers that are very good at taking hits. Again, I've shared some of these stories before, but like I've seen an entire dresser dropped on top of a Vita screen first. I put a screen protector on there and it was already good to go. They're very, very resilient. The only times that the things tend to get damaged is actually on the analog sticks. Now you might say, oh, there you go, it's just completely worthless then. But the thing with analog sticks is that they're very, especially in the case of the Vita, is that they are mass-produced and replaceable. The rest of those components are, well, actually, in the case of the Vita, also mass-produced and replaceable for a different reason. But they're generally, you don't want to be replacing a lot of the other stuff. In the case of replacing the analog sticks, instead of a complicated teardown process, it's basically you undo some screws on the back, you pull out a ribbon cable for the touchscreen, you pull out 2 screws to release a little metal latch to let the inside chips get separated, and then you just pop out the old analog stick and pop in a new one. Put the 2 ribbon cables back in, put the screws back in, and you're done. It's like a 10-minute process. Super easy. And part of the reason that this works as well as it does... actually, can we entomb this guy? Part of the reason that it works as well as it does is again, internally, it's actually built the way, funnily enough, just like a Switch is, where it's actually separated off into different parts. So, like, let's say, even if, let's say, somebody goes and takes a drill through your entire Vita there, it ends up essentially in a situation that only one of the boards is damaged, the rest of it is still salvageable. Additionally, due to the fact that it's just like the PSP, extremely lightweight, it tends to mean that if, for example, anything happens to the charging cord while it's attached, it tends to travel with the cord, meaning that more often than not, they won't end up getting as damaged, or potentially might just avoid getting damaged entirely. Now, this is potentially very, very good. Like, as an example, there was one time that I had a PSP that I was going and testing out, and my kiddo ran into the office, tripped over the charging cord, and sent the thing essentially arcing through the air face first onto concrete. And you couldn't even tell that anything happened to it. Because again, spongy buttons took that hit. The cord took the device along with it, and it didn't end up ripping out the charging port. And additionally, the charging port is separately secured by screws at the base, as well as being secured in other places, meaning that it isn't just simply relying on the solder on the board or, the pins inside to keep it in place. The reason that this matters is for the same reason that Switch ports tend to get broken so much of the damn time. Like right now, my son's Switch Lite had its charging port broken because he tended to play it with it plugged in, and so it was either that or he plugged it in weird or whatever else. But still, the pins got bent. One of the nice things about these older devices is that, frankly, they kind of understood at the time that maybe it's a good idea to have fewer pins on these things. Maybe it's a good idea to have less kind of complications to their charging ports and stuff like that. Because, like, for example, a micro USB, I have yet to see a single Vita in years of working on them, replacing them, whatever else. I've yet to see a single Vita whose charging port was actually completely toast. I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure folks have run into that issue. I've seen folks replacing them with a USB-C mod. But that's the thing. Even if it somehow manages to get broken, at that point, you still just get an upgrade anyway. You just switch it to a more modern port. As more modern stuff is still compatible with it. Now, personally, I would not, it wouldn't really feel like going down that particular road, but it is something that I've seen folks doing. So, either way, again, due to the design of these things, I have yet to see a Vita Slim with a broken charging port. I've seen the occasional burnt out port for something like a PSP, but those are, again, like $4 or $5 to replace, and it's a simple swap job. You basically unplug the old one, put the new one in. It's a screw and a little bit of plastic that holds it in place, and because it's so lightweight, that's all it needs. In the case of something like the Switch, there's typically going to be soldering involved. You're going to have to do a lot of extra stuff to keep everything kind of functioning, So repairing a Switch is a sharp increase in difficulty just due to the fact that it's trying to be small, but at the same time it's trying to be complex, and this leads to a lot of components very tightly together. Whereas, for example, let's say something like the Steam Deck has a sort of similar but opposite issue in which people love working on those things because they were made to be taken apart. There is no kind of, go send it out to a repair service for an extra $100 type of a situation out there. So they will typically do a better job of kind of being tinkerable. The only issue that people have with damaging their Steam Decks upon repairing is if they forget to take out the micro SD card. I'm not entirely sure why that is so much of an issue to not... Who doesn't take out their micro SD card before starting, honestly? So you don't want it to get hit by static anyway. Just get it out of there, step one. Anyway. So yeah, hopefully that helps to explain some of that. Now, one more note that I want to bring out here is actually when it comes to memory. Because this, again, funnily enough, this is actually another one that the Steam Deck kind of just wins. But I do have to throw the Sony handhelds and several SBC devices out there as kind of secondary contenders. So when it comes to memory, it can be difficult to keep all of your save games going. And some, especially anyone familiar with a Switch, might have that paranoia that if their device dies, their device's memory, everything that, like all of their saves, everything is just tied to that motherboard. If anything happens to that motherboard, it's impossible to get it back, right? And so to that end, one of the interesting things about these older devices is that typically your memory cards just come out and they have your memory on there instead of on the motherboard because they weren't worried about people cloning Pokemon saves. So what we have in that situation is a case where, like, if you have a PSP that gets catastrophically destroyed, it's basically if you've ever watched the show Altered Carbon, or apparently it was a comic at some point, where unless that brain chip gets destroyed, they're basically just fine. You just pop out that memory card, pop it into a new one, you're golden. There's no muss, no fuss, or anything. Usually your mods will already, or your custom firmware will be saved as an update file on that thing. So realistically, there's not even anything to worried about having to remod the thing. You just go in there, click on the update file. Hey, your custom firmware has loaded, and you're good to go, right? So that is really good stuff. That's really convenient. That's really handy. It's just great. And the Vita, if it's modded, is actually very similar. See, an out-of-the-box PS Vita is, to be blunt, a little shitty, because they had a whole bunch of proprietary nonsense that led to them being just a pain in the neck from a lot of different directions, with proprietary memory cards that were really prone to failure. Again, I've seen folks argue with me that, no, they were actually great. No, look, every single one, with the exception to this one sitting in front of me, right now, in this little box, if I shake it, I'm scared it's going to break. With exception to that one, I've had, I believe, up to 7 memory cards for these things fail on me. Again, a couple of them were new when I got them. Just randomly kind of found them at retro shops, brand new, for like $25. That was a miracle find, but even those ended up failing. Like, they all ended up failing. Those M2 cards were trash. But as soon as the SD to Vita mod came out, now any old SD card is essentially your new memory card. And additionally, this came with the cool functionality that if, for example, anything happens to your device, you're now in a position that you simply pop it out and pop it into the next Vita. Now, technically, you're supposed to go detach it from the first Vita and then reassign it to the second Vita, but realistically, I have forgotten to do that before, and it was still just fine. So, yeah, it's basically the same way as the PSP for those right there. As long as you don't take the SD card out of the adapter, you're golden. So, yeah, great stuff there. Additionally, it's worth noting that as far as the Steam Deck goes, sure, you'll have all of your stuff on your SD card, but it's mostly game files that are on there because most of your files are saved in the cloud. But wait a minute, this, what if it's a service that I don't trust or whatever? Yeah, Steam has been around frickin' forever, and they've done a fantastic job of backing up saves. I still have saves from games that I have not played in over 2 decades, and they're still up there. I don't even know when they would have gotten uploaded or whatever else. They're just kind of there. As far as I'm aware, that upload function didn't even exist when they were around, so again, I don't know. But still, they're there. Like, I still have my new Vegas saves from, like, friggin' launch year. So, yeah, it's by far going to be the best at that particular thing. And technically, Switch has the option to back them up to the cloud as well. You know what I'm gonna say. Don't trust Nintendo. Like, they make cool IPs. Don't trust that they're going to maintain that to any degree. It will eventually die, and maybe it'll get some exorbitant price hike. Maybe it'll just randomly get shut down one day, but I would not trust that to stick around. So that's another thing to consider. Now, one more thing to consider for those SBC devices, and this is personally why I don't use them, is going to be what kind of older games you can play on there and how you play some of those older games. Because there's no question over the fact that that there's a hell of a lot of stuff that can run through RetroArch, which is what many of those SBC kind of emulator devices use. Here's the problem with this. RetroArch is like Nintendo. You should not rely on it. It's, again, why I love, like, why I personally landed on the Vita here, because it has that as an option. It has most of the same options that the standard RetroArch does, but it additionally has the thing that you can use standalone emulators. If you can use standalone emulators, and many of those same devices will have that option, you should. You absolutely should, because in RetroArch's case, it has this weird thing where if, for example, anything crashes, anything you did during that section, or anything you did during that play session, is gone. It's just gone. It's just how the thing functions. It's saved temporarily on whatever you're doing, and if it crashes, it's not saved. You can set it to auto-save, but in my personal experience, sometimes it just kind of forgets to do that, so I don't know what that's about, but just, it's kind of finicky in that way, though it does have some additional functions to it as well. Like, technically, you can have cloud saves that you're doing through that as well. There's going to be a lot of asterisks over whether this stuff will work for you, whether it's potentially too complicated to work for you. For a lot of folks, fiddling with RetroArch might just be too much of a pain in the neck. I personally don't like how fiddly it is. I don't like how prone to failure it is. Like, I just absolutely hate RetroArch. But when it comes to, for example, standalone emulators like, you know, MGBA or GBSP over on the PSP even, I've yet to see those ever crash in years of using them. I've yet to see anything crash on the Vita there either. The only thing I have seen crash on the Vita as far as emulators go are, well, shock of shocks, once again, those same RetroArch cores. So I really don't like RetroArch for that reason. So if it is your primary thing, maybe you like fiddling with it until it magically works for you. Maybe you're one of those folks that likes having those achievement functions on there, and likes you know, going to try to set up the cloud saves and everything else for it. I personally would prefer the functionality of just having my essentially just having the standalone version work just fine on the device and just transferring one chip to another. It's not perfect by any means, but in my experience, it's been more reliable for something that you're carrying around every day. Because for a device that's shaken around a lot, that's potentially seeing a lot of battering around, sometimes when it comes to Android-powered devices, sometimes they'll have a little bit of a delay when they're coming out of sleep mode. Maybe they'll have a little bit of a delay going into sleep mode. Maybe they'll just kind of decide to update in the middle of going to sleep, and then just suddenly it's been sitting in your pocket, and you reach into your pocket, and it's completely overheating because it just decided to randomly do an update instead of saving the game. So not only did you potentially lose, you know, like an hour plus of progress since you last went and shut down RetroArch, instead you also now have this situation that this thing's battery is roasted. It is, you know, it's acting up because you managed to let it die all the way. They really don't like when you, those emulator devices really do not like when they die all the way, just so you know. Never let them drain completely. It's kind of the weird gremlin rule, I guess you could say, of emulator handhelds. But anyways, yeah. So there's just a lot of asterisks to those devices. I just personally found that they're not as durably built. Parts are generally harder to find for them. They tend to have, you know, kind of glitches and things like that. And that's actually the last thing. I don't think I don't believe I mentioned this earlier. But when it comes to availability of parts, like, PSPs were ridiculously prevalent. There's still plenty of kind of secondhand parts out there. Plenty of remake parts out there. There's plenty of parts available for the Vita because there was just way more parts made than there were actual devices that were sold. like there's just tons and tons and tons of stuff to potentially consider there, you know? So, so just know that stuff like that typically will have parts available for it. Like old GBAs, DSs, 3DSs, all that. Parts are also similarly easy to come up with, but again, similar with a lot of Nintendo devices, they're just seen as a toy. They may get you some funny looks when you're out and about. They may get you some shade from other, other responsible adults, as it were. But I will say, as a kind of last little personal story here, I was working in retail years ago, kind of at the height of COVID there, and there was people had brought all kinds of devices with them to work. And for example, the person on their phone kept running into the issue that their phone or that their game did not have a pause, and they were afraid of losing their progress. The person on the Switch was sitting in the back because they didn't want to be seen with it in the front. I was sitting there at the register, on the Vita, and just basically pocketing it before somebody opened the second door into the store. That pocketability factor is very, very useful to consider. It's something that you really should bear in mind. It's more than a minor kind of convenience thing. The mobility of a lightweight device is something that's easy to overlook. Like mobility, efficiency, whatever else is easy to overlook. Like battery-wise, if I plug, for example, a simple micro USB into this Vita here, I can know that it'll be charged in like roughly 10-15 minutes-ish while I'm going to, let's say, a doctor's appointment or something else, right? Like if I'm leaving it behind for whatever reason, I plug it into the car's USB port, I know it's probably going to be fully charged by the time I get back. Steam Deck can't even maintain its own power off of a car's power. The Switch can kind of sort of maintain, but it's not going positive. But again, lower end, cheaper devices or just lower power use devices tend to charge very well. And even in terms of battery life, like let's say comparing with something like a Vita to Switch there. Like a Vita, if I'm running PSP games, which again I'm usually playing One Vision with modded One Vision on this thing. In this particular instance, like we're talking about a case that again I'm potentially seeing days worth of battery life before it ever even needs to charge. Like one of the things I regularly stop myself from doing is plugging it in at the end of the day because it's like I've been playing it a ton during the day and it's at like 74%. I don't know why I'm shooting an empty tile here. Anyway, so yeah, like. It's just one of these cases where it's like it's at 74%. I don't want the battery to get needlessly stressed, so I'm just going to go ahead and wait till tomorrow to go plug it in. That is a very nice consideration to have. Let's say something like the Switch there, realistically it's probably dead at the end of a sit-down session. The PSP, probably give it a couple sessions before it's toast if you're running an original battery. If you're running a good reproduction, it may potentially get a good bit more than that, depending. Like a good camera Encino, I've seen the prediction thing go up to like 16 hours on that thing. But again, that's if you're using one of the really chunky ones on one of the more efficient models of the actual device itself. So it depends. Like you can get a lot of different mileage out of those, but this was the amount of thought that went into just sticking with a PSP or Vita for me personally. Just the sheer amount of kind of complexities that can come up from picking a device. It goes far beyond library or power or whatever else. Like you got to make the cost work. You got to make the kind of pocketability factor work. You have to always make sure that you have the right device with you for the right time. Like I would never bring, like, let's say the Steam Deck with me to work unless I know it's going to be a quieter day, because if I'm getting deliveries in a rougher neighborhood, I don't want anybody to look at that thing and decide, hey, it's go time. But somebody sees a PSP, they're like, oh, that's old junk, who cares? No one's going to go out of the way for that. In the case of let's say something like a DS or other Nintendo thing, again, those are easily sellable, so that's something that somebody might potentially look through a window and they're like, oh, look, I know what that is. Quick smash and grab here, or if you left your door open, maybe something else, I'm not saying that this is a regular thing, but I know that there have been multiple instances when I was going out and doing delivery work and there were attempted muggings, so, these are things that you run into every now and then. So just kind of something to bear in mind. Obviously, there's a lot of considerations to all this stuff. Your situation may vary. I mean, if you're somebody that's effectively, let's say, working security at, third shift or whatever else at a museum, there's nobody else there, there's nothing else going on, it's just you for hours watching, a friggin' Monet or something, then, you're pretty much going to be completely golden, just kind of doing whatever the hell you want, just bringing a Steam Deck to work or what have you. At that point, just plugging it in and playing whatever the hell you want, ideal situation. Maybe you're somebody that has kids and they always leave their Switches in the car, and you're in the car all day. You're somebody that's going around, maybe doing sales meetings or what have you. Maybe that's perfect for you. Maybe you're not interacting with people. If you're spending a lot of time in waiting rooms, maybe something else works for you there. Maybe you're somebody that, let's say, is one of them lady types and happens to have a purse with you at all times. Maybe one of those potentially more breakable single board computers there might fit the bill a bit better because you have a way more protective thing that's always carried on you. I mean, personally, I always end up wearing a vest with me wherever I go because it's, frankly, my same equivalent of that same idea, where I keep all of my stuff in there at all times. I keep my wallet in one pocket, I keep my important papers that I need to, like, let's say, call about bills or call about other things in another pocket, phone in one pocket. I have one dedicated zip pocket for whatever handheld I have with me at any given time, usually a Vita, and that's kind of about that. It works out perfectly. So, anyway, hopefully this helped at least jog some ideas as far as what might work for you. Maybe the stuff that worked for me didn't work for you. Maybe it ended up shifting up some ideas on something that may potentially give you a bit more value. Who knows? But let me know if this was useful for you. Yeah, I gotta go get started for the day. So y'all have yourselves a good one. Take care, and thank you for stopping by. Later.